In 1794, roughly 7,000 armed men gathered outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, prepared to march on the young United States government. They burned the home of a federal tax official to the ground. They tarred and feathered government agents, stripped them naked in the middle of winter, and left them on the roadside as a warning. In response, President George Washington did something no American president has done before or since. He put on his old Revolutionary War uniform, mounted a horse, and personally led an army of nearly 13,000 soldiers into the field to crush his own citizens. 13,000 troops. That was a larger force than Washington had commanded at many battles of the Revolutionary War itself, mobilized not against a foreign king, but against farmers in the hills of western Pennsylvania. And the cause of all of it, the thing that nearly tore the brand new republic apart before it had even finished writing its own rules, was not land, or slavery, or religion. It was whiskey. A drink you can buy today for $20 at any liquor store in the country nearly triggered a civil war 4 years after the Constitution was ratified. So how did a barrel of distilled corn and rye become the single greatest test of federal authority in the first decade of American independence? How did whiskey go from farmhouse necessity to the spark of armed rebellion to, eventually, one of the most profitable and heavily regulated industries on earth? That standoff outside Pittsburgh was the climax. But the story of whiskey does not start in Pennsylvania. It starts thousands of years earlier, in a part of the world with no concept of the United States, no concept of taxation without representation, and no concept of whiskey at all. Only the accidental discovery that grain, water, and time could produce something extraordinary. The earliest evidence of humans distilling liquid for something other than drinking goes back roughly 4,000 years to Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq. Archaeologists have found clay pot stills used to distill perfumes and aromatic oils, not alcohol, but the basic principle was already there. Heat a liquid, capture the vapor, cool it back into a purer, more concentrated form. That principle, heating and condensing, is the entire secret behind every spirit ever made. Nobody in Mesopotamia was drinking the output. They were making perfume. But the technology existed, and technology has a way of wandering. It took a very long time for that wandering technology to meet alcohol. Fermented grain beverages, essentially crude beers, had existed for thousands of years across the ancient world, from Sumeria to Egypt to early China. Fermentation is comparatively easy. Left alone, grain and water and wild yeast will turn into something alcoholic almost by accident. Distillation is a different problem entirely. It requires controlled heat, a container that can trap vapor, and a cooling mechanism to turn that vapor back into liquid. That is not something a farmer stumbles into. That is something that requires deliberate engineering. And the people who first combined the two, fermentation and true distillation of alcohol, were medieval scholars working roughly 1,200 years ago in the Islamic world. Alchemists such as Jabir ibn Hayyan, working in the 8th century, refined distillation apparatus that would eventually make its way, through trade routes, translated manuscripts, and the slow contact between cultures, into medieval Europe. By the time distillation knowledge reached the British Isles, it landed in an unusual place: monasteries. Monks were, for centuries, some of the only literate people in Europe with access to both scientific texts and the free time to experiment. They were not distilling to get drunk. They were distilling for medicine. Distilled alcohol was believed, with some genuine basis, to have antiseptic and preservative properties, and it became a base for tinctures, remedies, and treatments across monasteries in Ireland and Scotland. And it is in exactly these two places that the drink we now call whiskey gets its name and its earliest documented existence. The Gaelic term was Uisce Beatha, which translates directly to water of life. Over centuries of mangled pronunciation by English speakers, Uisce Beatha became Usquebaugh, and Usquebaugh eventually collapsed into the word whiskey. This story starts almost 700 years before Pittsburgh, in monasteries scattered across Ireland and Scotland, where monks were boiling grain mash in copper pots for reasons that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with survival. In a world with limited medicine and brutal winters, a warming, preservable, alcoholic tincture was not a luxury, it was treatment. The first written record of whiskey in Ireland appears in the Annals of Clonmacnoise, an Irish chronicle, which notes that a chieftain died in the year 1405, after, in the words of the annal, taking a surfeit of aqua vitae, the Latin term for water of life, at Christmas. In other words, the first mention of whiskey in the historical record is someone drinking himself to death with it. That is, somehow, a fitting beginning. Across the water in Scotland, the earliest official record comes from the Exchequer Rolls of Scotland in the year 1494, a royal tax and expenditure ledger, which records an order to a friar named John Core for 8 bowls of malt, enough grain to produce something in the range of 1,500 bottles by modern measure, with the explicit purpose to make aqua vitae. That single line in a government ledger is the birth certificate of Scotch whiskey. And notice what it already is, a government record. Whiskey and taxation were tangled together from the very first sentence history ever wrote about it. For the next several centuries, whiskey slowly spread outward from the monasteries into farmhouses and villages across Ireland and Scotland. It became a natural byproduct of subsistence farming. Grain that could not be sold or stored easily could be converted into whiskey, which lasted far longer, was far more valuable by volume, and was far easier to transport over rough terrain than raw grain ever could be. This is where whiskey earns its first real identity, not as a luxury item for kings, but as a practical solution to a logistics problem, a way for isolated rural farmers to preserve value and generate income. 10 bushels of grain, heavy, bulky, perishable, could be reduced down into 2 kegs of whiskey, light, stable, and worth far more per pound. Farmers across the Scottish Highlands and the Irish countryside were not distillers by trade. They were distillers by necessity, running small, illegal stills tucked into hillsides and hollows, out of sight of anyone who might tax them. And someone was always trying to tax them. As whiskey production grew from a monastic curiosity into a widespread rural industry, governments in both Scotland and England noticed. Here is the pattern that should sound familiar by the end of this story. Anytime a population figures out how to produce something valuable at scale, a government eventually shows up wanting a cut. The Scottish Parliament imposed its first tax on malt used for whiskey production in the year 1644, and it did not go well. Illicit distilling exploded. Smuggling networks formed almost overnight. Entire rural economies in the Scottish Highlands reorganized themselves around evading government excise officers, who were, understandably, not popular guests in small farming communities. By the 1700s, it is estimated that the overwhelming majority of whiskey consumed in Scotland was produced illegally, untaxed, and unregulated, hidden in barns, caves, and remote glens specifically chosen because government agents could not easily reach them. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expects if they think of whiskey as simply a drink. Whiskey, from its earliest documented centuries, was never just a drink. It was a currency, a tax battleground, and a symbol of resistance to distant central authority, long before a single barrel ever touched American soil. The farmers hiding stills in the Scottish hills in the 1600s and the farmers who would take up arms in Pennsylvania in the 1790s were separated by an ocean and more than a century, but they were fighting, in essence, the exact same fight. A government trying to tax a product that rural people considered theirs by right, produced with their own grain, their own labor, and their own risk. That resistance culture crossed the Atlantic Ocean directly, carried in the memories and the stills of the people who left Scotland and Ireland for a new life in North America. Beginning in the early 1700s and accelerating for decades afterward, waves of Scots-Irish immigrants, families originally from Scotland who had settled for a generation or two in Ulster, in the north of Ireland, before crossing to America, poured into the colonies. They landed largely in Pennsylvania, and from there pushed west and south into the Appalachian frontier, into exactly the kind of remote, hard-to-govern terrain their ancestors had used to hide stills from tax collectors back home. They brought farming tools, family Bibles, a deep and hard-earned suspicion of distant government, and, quite literally, the knowledge and equipment to distill whiskey. German immigrants, arriving in similar numbers into Pennsylvania around the same period, brought their own distilling traditions as well, and the combination of Scots-Irish and German settlers on the Pennsylvania frontier created one of the most whiskey-saturated regions in the entire New World. On the American frontier, whiskey was not a luxury item, it was infrastructure. Farmers in western Pennsylvania grew abundant crops of corn and rye, but the region had almost no usable roads over the Appalachian Mountains and no reliable way to ship raw grain to the eastern markets in Philadelphia or Baltimore, hundreds of miles away across brutal terrain. A pack horse could carry only a few bushels of raw grain over the mountains, and by the time it arrived, the cost of transport could exceed the value of the grain itself. But that same pack horse could carry the distilled, concentrated equivalent of many bushels in the form of a couple of kegs of whiskey. Whiskey was, in the most literal sense, a way to compress bulky, low-value grain into a compact, high-value, transportable product. Think about that for a second. This was not about getting drunk. This was about surviving as a farmer in a region cut off from the national economy. Whiskey became so central to frontier life on the Pennsylvania border that it functioned as an actual currency. Farmers paid their debts in whiskey. Ministers accepted whiskey as part of their salary. Whiskey was used to pay laborers at harvest time, to settle accounts at the local store, to trade for tools and livestock. In a region with almost no circulating coin currency, whiskey was, in effect, money you could drink. And here is where the story pivots hard into national politics, because at the exact moment whiskey had become the backbone of the Western Pennsylvania economy, the brand new United States government found itself in a financial emergency that would collide with it directly. The American Revolutionary War had ended in 1783, and it left the new nation buried in debt. The federal government owed roughly $54 million, and individual states owed a combined total of roughly $25 million more, staggering sums for an economy that barely functioned as a unified whole. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury under President Washington, believed that resolving this debt crisis was not just a financial necessity, but the single most important act that could secure the credibility and survival of the entire American experiment. In his report on public credit delivered to Congress in January of 1790, Hamilton proposed that the federal government pay off the war debt at full face value and assume responsibility for the individual states' remaining debts as well, consolidating everything under federal control. This was not just accounting. It was a deliberate strategy to bind wealthy creditors, the very people whose loyalty and investment the new republic desperately needed, directly to the success and stability of the federal government itself. But a bold plan to pay off enormous debt requires an equally bold source of revenue, and this is where Hamilton reached for something that had never existed before in American history: an excise tax on a domestically produced good. Congress passed the tax in March of 1791, and it became known immediately and infamously as the whiskey tax. It was the first tax the federal government had ever levied directly on a product made inside the United States, and Hamilton chose whiskey specifically because it was widely consumed, difficult to avoid, and, he calculated, would be seen as a tax on a vice rather than a necessity. He was catastrophically wrong about how it would be received on the frontier, and here is the detail that made the whole system feel rigged from the very beginning. The tax was not structured evenly. Distillers could pay either a flat annual fee based on the size of their still, which strongly favored large, efficient urban distillers who ran their equipment constantly, or they could pay by the gallon actually produced, which was the only realistic option for small frontier farmers who distilled seasonally in modest batches. Large eastern distillers paid a lower effective rate per gallon. Small backcountry farmers, distilling whiskey a few weeks a year using whatever surplus corn and rye they had left over, paid a dramatically higher effective rate. This was not a tax that fell evenly. It was a tax that punished exactly the population least able to absorb it. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains almost everything that follows. On top of the unequal tax structure, anyone accused of violating the excise law was required to travel, at their own expense, to face trial in a federal court, and the only federal court authorized to hear these cases sat in Philadelphia. For a farmer in the hills west of Pittsburgh, that meant a journey of over 300 miles across the Appalachian Mountains just to answer a legal summons. An impossible burden that could bankrupt a small farm regardless of the outcome of the trial. It was not just a tax. It was a tax enforced through a legal system deliberately, or at minimum, effectively, stacked against the very people it targeted most. The reaction on the Pennsylvania frontier was immediate, and it was furious. This was not about seasoning food or funding an army against a foreign enemy. To these farmers, this looked exactly like the taxation they had fought a revolution to escape. A distant government, in this case their own, imposing financial burdens on people who had no meaningful voice in how that money was spent or how the law was written. Protests began almost as soon as the tax took effect. Farmers organized committees, held public meetings, and drafted formal petitions of grievance. But protest quickly escalated past petitions. In September of 1791, a tax collector named Robert Johnson arrived in Washington County, Pennsylvania, to begin registering local stills. A group of men, their faces disguised, ambushed him, stripped him, tarred and feathered him, and shaved his head, then left him on the road as a message to any other tax collector who might follow. Tarring and feathering was not simply humiliation. It was a form of ritual violence with real physical danger. Hot tar could cause serious burns, and the psychological effect on the victim and on the community was deliberate and brutal. This was not an isolated incident. Over the following 2 years, similar attacks on tax collectors, informants, and even farmers who cooperated with federal authorities occurred repeatedly across western Pennsylvania. Homes were burned, barns were destroyed. Anonymous letters, signed with the name Tom the Tinker, began appearing, threatening anyone who registered their still or paid the tax with the destruction of their still and their property. If a distiller submitted, his still might be shot full of holes, a punishment the letters cheerfully described as having a still mended by Tom the Tinker. This is where the story stops being a tax dispute and starts becoming an organized insurgency, complete with its own folk mythology, its own enforcement network, and its own symbolic language of resistance. For nearly 3 years, the federal government tried a combination of reduced enforcement and minor legal concessions, hoping the unrest would burn itself out. It did not. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the Whiskey Rebellion is about to stop being a series of scattered local protests and become a full-blown armed uprising against the government of the United States. The breaking point came in July of 1794. A federal marshal named David Lennox arrived in western Pennsylvania to serve legal writs against distillers who had refused to pay the excise tax and refused to register their stills. He was accompanied by General John Neville, a wealthy local landowner who also happened to be the regional tax inspector responsible for enforcing the law, which made him, by this point, one of the most despised men in the county. As Lennox and Neville attempted to serve their writs, word spread rapidly through the countryside, and an armed crowd began to gather. On July the 16th, roughly 30 to 50 armed men surrounded Neville's fortified estate, known as Bower Hill, demanding he surrender his commission as tax inspector. Neville, or armed men defending his property, opened fire, and in the exchange, a local militia leader named Oliver Miller was killed. The crowd retreated but did not disperse. They returned 2 days later, on July the 18th, with their numbers swollen to somewhere between 500 and 700 armed men, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War itself, now turning the exact same tactics of armed resistance against their own government that they had once used against the British Crown. In the second confrontation at Bower Hill, a respected local militia officer named James McFarland, who had genuine combat experience from the Revolutionary War, took command of the crowd and attempted to negotiate Neville's surrender. During the standoff, gunfire broke out again. James McFarland was shot and killed. Accounts differ on exactly who fired first and under what circumstances, and this is where historians urge caution. The surviving records come almost entirely from participants with strong motives to describe events in their own favor. But the outcome is not in dispute. McFarland's death enraged the crowd, and in the chaos that followed, Neville's mansion at Bower Hill, along with its outbuildings, was burned to the ground. Here is the uncomfortable reality that made this moment so dangerous for the young republic. This was not simply a riot. Within weeks, rebel organizers called for a mass meeting at a place called Braddock's Field, just outside Pittsburgh, and on August 1, 1794, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 armed men assembled there. Some estimates run even higher. Think about the scale of that for a moment. 7,000 armed men gathering in open defiance of federal law was not a protest. It was, functionally, the mobilization of an army, and some of the more radical voices in the crowd began openly discussing secession from the United States, or even an assault on Pittsburgh itself. Talk circulated of raising a liberty pole, the symbolic marker Revolutionary War patriots had once used to declare resistance to British rule, now aimed squarely at the government those same patriots had helped create less than 2 decades earlier. This decision to escalate seemed, to many of the men gathered at Braddock's Field, like the natural continuation of the fight their fathers and older brothers had fought against the British. It was not. It was about to collide with a president who understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what was at stake if this rebellion succeeded. George Washington faced a genuinely existential question. The Constitution itself was barely 5 years old. The Articles of Confederation, the loose, weak governing document that preceded it, had utterly failed, in part because the federal government under it had no power to raise revenue or enforce its own laws, a weakness starkly exposed just 8 years earlier by a similar uprising in Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. If armed farmers in Pennsylvania could simply refuse a lawfully passed federal tax and burn down the house of a federal official without consequence, then the new Constitution and the entire premise that the United States was a single functioning nation rather than a loose confederation of squabbling states was effectively dead on arrival. Washington understood that this was not really a fight about a tax on whiskey. It was a fight over whether the federal government of the United States actually had the authority to govern. So Washington did something extraordinary. Invoking the Militia Act of 1792, he called up militia forces from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, ultimately assembling a force of nearly 13,000 men, an army larger than many he had commanded during the entire Revolutionary War. And then, in a decision without precedent before or since in American history, Washington personally put on his old military uniform and rode at the head of that army into western Pennsylvania. This was the only time in American history that a sitting president has personally commanded troops in the field. Alexander Hamilton, the very architect of the tax that had sparked the crisis, rode alongside him, determined to see the confrontation through to the end. This is the part that should make you stop and reconsider what this moment actually was. This was not political theater. This was the President of the United States putting his own body on a horse to demonstrate in the most physical and unambiguous way possible that the federal government would enforce its laws. Here is the twist that surprises most people when they hear this story for the first time. When the army arrived in western Pennsylvania in October of 1794, the rebellion had already collapsed. Faced with an overwhelming professional military force, the vast majority of the armed farmers who had gathered at Braddock's Field simply melted back into the countryside. There was no climactic battle, no siege, no dramatic last stand. The Federal Army arrested roughly 150 suspected rebels, marched a number of them back to Philadelphia in humiliating conditions during a brutal winter, and ultimately put only 2 men on trial for treason: a man named Philip Weigel, sometimes recorded as Wiggle, and a man named John Mitchell. Both were convicted and sentenced to hang. And then, in a final move that reveals as much about the purpose of the entire operation as the invasion itself, President Washington pardoned both of them. The goal had never truly been mass punishment. The goal was to prove, decisively and publicly, that the federal government could and would enforce its own laws against its own citizens, and having proven that point through overwhelming, undeniable force, mercy became not just possible, but strategically wise. The consequences of the Whiskey Rebellion rippled outward for decades. It became the first serious test of federal authority under the new Constitution, and the government passed that test. It set a lasting precedent that the United States would use military force if necessary to enforce federal law within its own borders. A precedent that would echo in very different and far darker circumstances during events like the Civil War 6 decades later. It also deepened the growing political divide between Hamilton's Federalists, who saw the government's response as a necessary and justified defense of the rule of law, and the emerging Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson, who viewed the massive military response to a relatively small uprising as an alarming overreach of federal power against ordinary citizens exercising their right to dissent. That argument over how much power a central government should hold and how forcefully it should wield it did not end with the Whiskey Rebellion. In many ways, it is still being argued today. The tax itself did not survive much longer. It remained deeply unpopular and notoriously difficult to collect across the western frontier for the rest of the decade, and when Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801, his administration made repealing it a priority. Congress repealed the whiskey excise tax in 1802. The rebellion, in a strange and roundabout way, had won on the substance of the tax itself, even as it lost decisively on the question of federal authority. But the rebellion changed whiskey itself, and this is where the story turns from politics back into product. In the years following the uprising, a significant number of Pennsylvania farmers and distillers, weary of federal tax collectors and hungry for cheaper, more abundant farmland, packed up their families and their stills and moved further west and south into the territory that would become Kentucky. Kentucky offered something Pennsylvania never could: vast fields of corn, and something almost nobody thinks about but every distiller cares about intensely: limestone-filtered water naturally free of iron, which produces a smoother, sweeter final spirit. Farmers in this new frontier began making whiskey primarily from corn rather than the rye that had dominated in Pennsylvania, and aging it, sometimes by accident and sometimes by design, in barrels made of oak that had been charred on the inside. The origins of the name bourbon are genuinely disputed among historians. One common explanation ties it to Bourbon County, Kentucky, itself named in gratitude to the French royal house of Bourbon for France's military support during the American Revolutionary War, while other explanations point to Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where Kentucky corn whiskey was widely shipped and sold. Whether every detail of either origin story is precisely accurate remains debated among historians, but the result, the emergence of Kentucky as the undisputed heartland of American whiskey production, is beyond dispute. Industrialization transformed whiskey from a farmhouse product into a genuine national industry over the course of the 1800s. In 1830, an Irish inventor named Aeneas Coffey patented an improved column still, sometimes called a continuous still, which allowed distillers to produce far larger quantities of spirit far more efficiently than the traditional pot still ever could, running continuously rather than in individual batches. This single invention did for whiskey roughly what the cotton gin had done for cotton, taking a labor-intensive craft process and turning it into something approaching industrial-scale manufacturing. Distilleries grew larger, Production numbers climbed into the millions of gallons annually, and whiskey brands, rather than anonymous local farm product, began to emerge, with distillers building reputations and eventually legal protections around consistent quality and recognizable names. And then came a development that nobody in the whiskey industry could have predicted or prevented. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, and the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the entire country. This was not just a tax dispute anymore. This was total prohibition, and it very nearly ended the American whiskey industry outright. Hundreds of legal distilleries across Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and beyond were forced to shut their doors entirely. A small handful of distillers, fewer than 10 in total, were granted special federal licenses to continue producing whiskey legally for what was classified as medicinal purposes, sold through pharmacies with a doctor's prescription. An almost absurd loophole that kept the barest ember of legal American whiskey production alive for 13 years. Everyone else either went out of business, switched to producing something else entirely, or went underground into the world of moonshining, illegal, untaxed, unregulated whiskey production, run in secret, hidden from federal agents in exactly the same tradition of evasion that Scottish Highland farmers had practiced against British excise officers nearly 3 centuries earlier, and Pennsylvania farmers had practiced against Alexander Hamilton's tax collectors more than a century before that. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, but the American whiskey industry that emerged afterward was a fraction of its former size, and it would take decades to fully rebuild. Rebuild it did. Today, the American whiskey industry, and bourbon in particular, is worth billions of dollars annually and continues to grow. In 1964, the United States Congress formally declared bourbon a distinctive product of the United States. A legal designation that requires bourbon to be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn, distilled and aged entirely within the United States, and matured in new charred oak barrels. Protections roughly analogous to the way champagne is legally protected as a product that can only come from a specific region of France. Kentucky alone now produces somewhere in the range of 95% of the world's entire bourbon supply. But whiskey is far more than just food and drink at this point, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Here is a fact worth sitting with. There are currently more barrels of aging bourbon stored in the state of Kentucky than there are people living in the entire state. Kentucky's human population sits at roughly 4.5 million people. The number of aging bourbon barrels currently resting in Kentucky warehouses is estimated at well over 13 million. 13 million barrels. More whiskey aging quietly in the dark than there are people to drink it. And a portion of that whiskey never gets consumed by anyone at all. As barrels age, a small percentage of the spirit evaporates naturally through the porous wood, an amount distillers have nicknamed with genuine affection the angel share. Across the industry, the angel share is estimated to cost American distillers hundreds of millions of dollars in evaporated product every single year. Money literally rising into the air above Kentucky, one barrel at a time. So think about the full arc of this story for a moment. It was there in medieval monasteries in Ireland and Scotland, distilled by monks as medicine rather than pleasure. It was there in the illegal stills hidden in the Scottish Highlands, funding an early culture of resistance against a distant crown. It was there in the pack horses and pockets of Scots-Irish immigrants crossing the Atlantic Ocean to a new and uncertain frontier. It was there as literal currency on the American frontier, paying ministers, laborers, and debts in a region with no coins to spare. It was there when Alexander Hamilton needed to fund a bankrupt young nation and reached for the one product that could make or break the credibility of the entire American experiment. It was there when farmers in western Pennsylvania picked up the exact same rifles they had once carried against the British Crown and pointed them at their own government instead. It was there when George Washington, the only president in American history to personally lead troops into the field, rode at the head of 13,000 men to answer that challenge. And it is there today, quietly aging in more than 13 million barrels across the hills of Kentucky, waiting patiently in the dark, evaporating a little more of itself into the air every single year, whether anyone is watching or not. Not bad for a drink that started as a way to preserve leftover grain. If any part of this story surprised you, and if you did not already know that the President of the United States once personally led an army against his own citizens over a tax on whiskey, let me know which detail caught you off guard in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, ones where an everyday product turns out to be hiding an entire hidden history of empire, rebellion, and human ingenuity, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more of these coming, and I will see you in the next one.